Good morning, dearest friends. Thank you so much for being here today. Wednesday, the 5th of Nisan, the 6th of April. We're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. At the present, Masechet Shabbat, chapter 15, page 112b. We're talking about knots. Well, knots are used in many parts of daily living. Today, we have other techniques and methods of fusing and attaching and sealing. So we don't always use knots, though there are some residual knot use in our society. Once upon a time, you wanted to seal something shut. You wanted to close something up. You didn't have Velcro. You didn't have a zipper. You couldn't weld it shut, or maybe you could, but it would come at quite a cost. And so knots was the most likely solution to close something that will eventually possibly be opened, or something that just needs to be fused shut. And so we spoke about shoes. Shoemakers once upon a time used knots to secure certain components of the shoe to one another. And in addition to that, of course, there were the knots that the wearer made and did and undid, tied and untied. And then we also uncovered yesterday that some folks like to slip their feet out of the shoes without untying the knots, especially if they didn't walk very much. But that would actually be a Shabbos problem, because we want to avoid, certainly rabbinically, a long-term knot. And if you're going to tie if you're not going to untie, that gives it a certain degree of permanence. So we talked about shoes and the way that knots were used. And that segued us, and I should say we talked about shoes and sandals, and that led us to a spin-off conversation about what to do if your shoe breaks on Shabbos. I'm not going to say that it was a comprehensive discussion, but it was two related stories. One story was a rabbi, was it Abaye, whose shoe breaks in front of Rav Yosef, and he asks, what do I do? And he tells him, well, you can secure your shoe with a non-muksa item and get it home. And then we had another episode. Was it Rav Yirmiyah and, let me see who it was. It was Rav Yirmiyah and Rav Abahu, and his shoe broke. No, I'm sorry, it's reversed. Rav Yirmiyah and Rav Abahu were the ones who said to get the shoe home by wrapping it securely with a animal feed reed. When Abaya's shoe broke, Rav Yosef told him, leave it there. You'll get it after Shabbos. And so Rashi makes it clear that we're actually talking about two very distinct scenarios, one within a Carmelist and one within a Chatzer. Besides for the carrying issues, the main issue that's relevant here is that a Chatzer is protected. You could leave your ball, you could leave your mitt in the yard, and hopefully you'll come back in an hour or two or three and it'll still be there. You leave it in the park, you leave it outside in a public space, the odds are it will not be there. But what eventually comes out of this question is a much more fundamental question. We're talking about muksa, an item that is not an item. And by the way, muksa is the most well-known Shabbos word. And what we've discovered is there's a whole lot of Shabbos that the word of muksa doesn't properly apply. Now, we in English, let's say, or in spoken language, we might say a Shabbos prohibited item could be muksa. But muksa is only one dimension. It's the permissibility of handling something which, for whatever reason, is set apart from you, either because it has no use, or it can't be used, or its use is prohibited, or it's very, very precious and high value, and therefore you're not going to tinker with it in the way that you intend, and a few other scenarios. So finally, it must be a little bit of a relief. It's good for me, to finally be able to revisit that word muksa, which is so central to our Shabbos experience and our Shabbos lexicon, and yet not always at the forefront of our discussions. Doctor.
You mentioned, I'm sorry, I wasn't there yesterday, but you mentioned that Abaya, or you could fix it if you use a substance that's not muksa. So my question is is Scotch tape muksa? Is Velcro? I really want to get back to Velcro because I have a problem with Velcro. I'm just saying that it seems to me so clearly something that tears, and that, I just don't understand. And I know it's totally acceptable, at least in the circles that I'm used to being in, that people use it. So what I had
I'm glad you asked the question. Let me back up for a moment, because I realized it's good that you weren't here yesterday, so you caught me in a inaccuracy that I said, which maybe the folks that were here yesterday would have said, oh yeah, he didn't mean that. So I'm glad in retrospect. I didn't mean that you could fix the shoe. That was inarticulate. He's allowed to temporarily secure the shoe to the extent that he could get it into the private property. A proper repair would obviously that would be a problem. So I was inarticulate, and I'm glad you caught me on that. As far as the Velcro, I think there probably are other issues that are worthy of discussion. But if we're going to view it very narrowly through the prism of a knot, we can see that Velcro is not a knot. It is not a knot. A Velcro, the whole technique works differently. But if we imagine we're going to consider it a knot, and we can't consider it a knot, but one of the most essential parts of the knot discussion is permanence. And one thing I think we can all agree is that Velcro was designed to solve a problem where things are too permanent. Velcro allows for great ease of securing and attaching and detaching. It also doesn't really have, for the most part, the same strength. It can't hold the same amount of weight, let's say, as a knot. So for those reasons, this is not a comprehensive discussion on Velcro, not because I don't want to address it, just because there are other factors that I need to research before I present to you. But viewing Velcro and cross-referencing it with the conditions of knots, it's clear that Velcro has different halachic treatment. Although Velcro is used in many places where knots are used, for example, sneakers or sandals or garments. And so it is in our society, it is interchangeable in many contexts, or at least the designers might choose to use one or the other. But for the purposes of Shabbos, I believe, and again, I haven't done a recent research, that Velcro would be much preferred to a knot. Doctor?
Just another question about muktzah.
Okay.
Magnets.
Oh.
Magnets, muktzah. And I ask this because we use magnets unwittingly all the time in terms of kitchen cabinets, in terms of things of that nature. Other cabinets open, close, so what's the deal?
I don't believe that magnets are prohibited per se. I'm sure we could find a hypothetical where the strength of the magnet and the manipulation of the magnet uses electricity or other
electricity, yeah,
or other elements,
right,
that are a problem, but magnets on their own,
right,
I don't believe are a problem.
good.
I have a question. How about a lady's heel, a shoe? A lady's heel or a shoe breaks.
I can't hear you, but I'm not sure if it's your speaker or my.
A lady's heel, a shoe.
Okay.
Lady's heel, shoe.
What's the question?
I'm saying, what happens if it breaks on Shabbos?
She gets shorter.
I mean, look, if you ask me to imagine what it feels like to wear a lady's shoes, I would say it causes discomfort. I don't know how you're allowed to go through the discomfort of wearing heels on Shabbos. I'm not saying that to be misogynistic. I'm simply trying to be sympathetic to the sacrifice of it. I do want to add, Doctor, now that you're bringing it up, on the issue of Velcro, what did I just do? On the issue of Velcro, the issue is not a knot. The area that it might conceivably be perceived as a problem, that's a lot of hedging, is when it tofer and korea, stitching and tearing. Because tofer and korea, stitching and tearing, those are by definition using thread to fasten two detached components. Korea is to tear them apart. And so Velcro, on one hand, has a certain overlap with tofer, with stitching. But the poskim seem to say that it is okay. The poskim seem to say it's okay, although it has, because the comparison is superficial, but I believe the permanence is very distinct. And even if you leave it fastened, ultimately it is a much more temporary construct than others. The reality is, it's funny, and I think someone pointed this out, Doctor. I think you pointed out. Oh no. When we put the gartel, we put the belt around the Torah. So there are three techniques. There is the tying technique, There's the Velcro technique, and then you have the clip, like the clip, like the clasps, which for some reason our shul, I don't know if we have any clasp gartels, but that's certainly like what I imagine of, of times past, let's say. And when I say times past, I don't mean 1,000 years ago. I don't think they'd clasp, but I mean like 50 years ago or 30 years ago. So I don't know when we transitioned from clasps to Velcro. I think there's also a certain chashivos with the clasp, and Velcro is a little bit more, commercial.
There's also the vimple, the Yekish vimple.
Oh, yeah.
And tying a Sefer Torah.
What is that?
The Yekish vimple, a vimple. Yeah.
Oh, was it tie? Yes, I never saw it in real life.
No, it's wrapped around.
Yeah.
It's when a child is born.
Right.
They make this wimple. It's a long strip of cloth with psukim on it, and then they tie it around. They wrap it around, and then the end, tug it in at the top. There's no tie. But that's the way it's done with a wimple, with the extra wimple.
You've never seen it, Rabbi? Oh,
I've seen it, but I haven't seen it in practice. I've seen it.
Yeah.
I've read it. I've read of it. I've seen pictures of it. I've seen it in museums.
I've done it.
Actually, I have a confession, man. I don't think I ever davened in a Yekish shul. I've davened with Yekis, but I've never davened in a. I guess I have to go up to Washington Heights and at least.
You'd have to come on time.
You know the joke about the Yekka.
Funklish guy.
Rabbi, what about a person putting on a tie?
Good question. So, but going back to Yekis for a moment, they tell about the guy who walked into the Yekish shul and he asks, "Are you davening now?" And they say no. So they ask, "Well, then when are you davening?" And he said, "Now." All right. Now it's time to get into the Gemara.
So is it a problem putting on a tie on Shabbos?
It's possible that people would prefer to tie the knot before Shabbos to avoid any
or make a loose knot.
Or a loose knot that can be
a loose Windsor.
Most tie knots are not permanent and can be untied by a single pull from pulling the end of the tie. I saw that, so how a rabbi did that, and I have also done it myself. It's just that we don't wear ties anymore. We are becoming Israelis.
Yeah, in Israel we don't wear ties, and in Miami,
Florida, we don't wear ties.
I have to confess, you may have noticed this. I don't really enjoy wearing ties. It's a problem. I have a fat neck and whatever. It doesn't work both. But I thought I'd have to wear ties in my profession. Then I came to Florida, and I've been able to. Maybe I'm sure there's something like grumble about it. But in Florida, you have to make the people comfortable, and the locals don't wear ties. The visitors wear ties.
Also in Brooklyn, Rabbi, we don't wear ties anymore.
Where?
Also in Brooklyn, we don't wear ties.
Where?
Brooklyn.
Also in Brooklyn, we don't wear ties.
Oh, and if that's the case, I'm losing faith. In Brooklyn, they don't wear ties. That's a shanda.
In Teaneck, you can't get an aliyah without a tie.
Yeah, in Manhattan as well. You can't certain shows. I don't know if you can get admission without wearing a tie. Anyways, all right, let's jump into the Gemara. Let's do something. So, I'm sorry, I was in the middle of a thought. So we went from a broken shoe being muksa, which what does that mean that it's muksa? It means it is not considered a keli. It's not considered a vessel. It is useless. You could fix it, but right now you cannot use it at all. It's not a keli. And this has bearings on the laws of muksa and also has bearings on the laws of Shabbos. Of Tuma and Tara, purity and impurity. A working keli is susceptible to ritual impurity. A utterly broken keli cannot contract ritual impurity. And so in the conversation between Abaya and Rav Yosef, where Rav Yosef tells Abaya, you leave the shoe where it is. Essentially, it is muktzah. How does he prove that the halacha should be like that it's muktzah? He says, because Rabbi Yochanan commented that the debate about ritual impurity can be applied to Shabbos. The fact that he chimes in the context of Rabbi Yehuda, who is restrictive and considers a keli to be ritually impure, from here we infer that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. We're now going to see some more discussion about this. So bear with me just a brief moment. Omar. He also Ravin. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rav Amar Rav. When Ravin arrived to Bavel from Eretz Yisrael, he shared a teaching of Rav that was conveyed to him via Rav Chanan. What did Rav say? Halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda, which is that if the outer strap of your sandal breaks, it is no longer susceptible to ritual impurity. It is not considered a vessel. And the same would apply to
112.
the laws of Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan, however, said differently. Rabbi Yochanan says, Ein halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda. The halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. And even if a strap, the outer strap is broken, it remains yet a keli for the laws of ritual impurity. And by extension, for the laws of Shabbos. Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan hachi. This does not sound consistent with our previously quoted Gemara. The Gemara previously said that Rabbi Yochanan says that the halacha follows Rabbi Yehuda. Didn't we say that from the fact that Rabbi Yochanan helps explain or clarify the halacha of Rabbi Yehuda, shows us that he believes the halacha is Rabbi Yehuda. Shema mina ki Rabbi Yehuda spherely. Obviously, he holds like Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, Amaro yenino ve'aliba the Rabbi Yochanan. The answer is there's a debate about what Rabbi Yochanan actually holds in this context. There's a debate if Rabbi Yochanan says that the outer strap is broken, the shoe is no longer a keli, or it is. The way it was quoted by Rav Yosef to Abaya, he holds that Rabbi Yochanan paskins like Rabbi Yehuda. But the tradition over here that Ravin shared was that Rabbi Yochanan does not paskin like Rabbi Yehuda. Let's see, Rashi, Rabba bar Archana Amra lahahid le'el, Ravin Amra. So we have Rabba bar Archana's way of quoting the story. We have Ravin's way of quoting the story. And indeed, there is not a consensus about the perspective, the halachic viewpoint of Rabbi Yochanan. It happens. Sometimes it happens that you can have a debate about what a person said. And that's what the Gemara asserts happened over here. And that's why we have in one place is someone asserts that Rabbi Yochanan says one thing, and elsewhere it asserts that Rabbi Yochanan says something else. We're now going to study a related topic. What did we say?
Can we just go back a little bit?
Yeah. Well,
if a lady is walking, we know now, we've learned a lot about what the roads looked like in those days, with urine on the horse manure and everything else on the road. If a woman breaks her shoe and she has to walk without her shoe, barefoot, wouldn't that be an emergency? Wouldn't you have to break Shabbos for that? To put on a shoe or to fix the shoe or to attach the shoe in a certain way?
I don't know. Interesting question. Well, first of all, we're not talking about men or women. We're talking about in general. And second of all, unless you're walking across a pit of scorpions or snakes, discomfort does not always trump Shabbos. Many times, Shabbos trumps discomfort. So as far as a question of pikuach nefesh, an emergency, I think it would be a case-by-case situation. But if we assert that a shoe is so utterly damaged, and by the way, what do we mean damaged? The shoe we're discussing here, it's really a sandal, and the straps broke off, and so the shoe does not adhere to the foot. The only way to make the shoe is not going to adhere to the foot. The primary solution is going to be to carry the shoe. And so here we're talking about a person that's more concerned about the value of the shoe than the protection the shoe provides. What do you do in a scenario where legitimately your shoe breaks apart and you have no shoe? What do you do then? That's what we're really talking about. And so if it so utterly doesn't work, then it becomes muksa, then you cannot carry it.
Alan, you didn't think of the possibility of carrying the young lady who shoe is
Oh, if it's that much of an emergency, yes, you should.
I would love to.
Reminds me of a number of anecdotes, both in the Jewish tradition as well as I think in other traditions. Tanan Hassam. So now we're going to go on to a related subject. Alan, I know I didn't fully answer your question.
No, but it's like germ warfare. You're walking in germs. You're walking in feces. You're walking in the pishachs. You're walking.
Yeah, I would say to try not to step. Well, I mean, you'll make a more compelling case in the winter. Hold on, in the winter, that's a compelling case. It may actually, to step without a shoe through the, through the snow or through the slushy ice, that could be very dangerous. But then I don't think you're wearing a shoe that's fastened to your foot with a strap. Then you're probably wearing something that you have more of a challenge getting off once you're wearing it. But we could probably come up with a scenario where we'd be challenged to figure out what to do. But here we're talking about wearing sandals at a time where the main issue is bringing it home and carrying it. Or, doctor?
The more realistic issue that we have to deal with, unfortunately, here is some people don't carry around bags for their dogs. So on you're walking on Shabbos and you step into a pile, and now you see it on your shoe and on your, how and when do you clean it off? And where?
That's actually a very good question. I don't want to fully explore it now.
Right.
But that is a very important question because
it happens.
There's a few different issues. Right. But let's.
Right.
Good question. Good question. What do you do? How do you do? Shalom Neida.
Shalom Neida.
But believe me, in the scheme of things, I'll tell you one thing. Make sure to take that shoe off before you go into the house. Otherwise, it gets a whole lot worse. All right. Tanan Hassam. A related teaching in the context of ritual purity and generally the way we view a broken vessel. It says like this: Kol clay bali batim, any privately owned keli. Shi'uran kiri moinim. When is it considered broken beyond repair? When there's a hole the size of a rimon, the size of a pomegranate. Rashi. The Gabe Kliates Tanalab Meseches Kalim. There's a tractate called Tractate Kalim that talks about ritual impurity of a vessel. And we're talking about a wooden vessel. And we say Shi'uran Kirimonim Litaher Mitumasam. For a vessel to be broken and to be considered so utterly destroyed that it is no longer ritually impure, it needs to have a hole the size of a pomegranate. You may recall we referenced such discussions, such halachas previously. Aval Pachas Mikan, a lesser break than that. A person yet desires to preserve, to maintain that keli, and therefore it is still a keli, it is still a vessel, and it remains ritually impure in temple time. So Alan, in the time of the Beis Hamikdash, there was a great deal of mindfulness about ritual purity and impurity, especially if you were a Kohen or a Levi or an Israelite who was attending the temple or engaged in ritually holy stuff, or you were part of societies who were extra mindful of purity. And I always love to point out that if you study the archaeological record or you study history of the Second Temple era in particular, there are many hallmarks. There are ways to identify which sect or faith lived where based on the design of the Kalim. Now, the truth is this is true for archaeology across all different sites. Many times the most available remnant of a civilization are the dishes they made and the design and method of its construction. When it comes to the Jewish people, there is a lot of insight as it pertains to the use of kalim that were not susceptible to ritual impurity. So I think you might read about chalk kalim, different kinds of vessels that didn't, that may have not been susceptible to ritual impurity. So back to our point here. You want to know if your vessel is still considered a vessel. Well, the question is, you owner, what's your relationship with the item? Do you keep it? Do you throw it out? a hole smaller than a pomegranate remains desirable, functional, and useful, and therefore you don't get rid of it. But now the Gemara has an interesting question. I think, Alan, you're going to like this question. Rabbi Chizkiah asked a question. Nikev kamaitzi zayis usasama. You made a hole, not you made a hole developed in your bowl, the size of a pomegranate. It is no longer functional. But what he did is he patched it up. Now it works again. Now you can put your salad in there, no problem. And then 5 months later, it developed another hole, the size of a pomegranate, and he patched it up. I'm sorry, I misread over here. There's a hole the size of an olive, and he fixed it. Another hole the size of an olive, and he fixed it. But eventually, the aggregate, collectively, all those holes, had they existed simultaneously, were the equivalent of the size of a pomegranate. Mahu, what is the halach?
That's a recurring argument, like we had with the dates, whether cumulative counts.
But it may be related, but it's actually distinct. In that here it was broken and repaired, so they aren't happening simultaneously. But could it yet be considered in aggregate a number of holes to cause the vessel to be no longer ritually impure? Let's see how the Gemara, we'll read Rabbi Stein's. In other words, do we say that because the sum of all the areas, of all the holes, adds up to the size of a pomegranate, the utensil is pure? Or do we say since the previous hole was filled, before the next one was formed, it remains ritually impure? That's the question. I think that's what I said, but Rabbi Steinsaltz certainly has a way with words.
Rabbi?
Yes?
Isn't it sort of a loosey-goosey thing to say the size of a pomegranate? It's not a very accurate measurement.
Reb Beryl, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard that question presented before?
Well, I imagine it could be any. Remember when we had the big fruit, the long cucumber, the short, whatever.
Yeah, so we have a number of shiurim in Judaism that are based off measures, either of the human body, the hand, the fist, finger, or different prevalent fruits, or olives, or eggs. And we always have this question about what to do with a measurement which is not precise down to the millimeter.
Right. Also, not all pomegranates are the same size.
So whatever we answered in the past will apply here, which is we follow the professor's doctrine, which is that it's possible that once upon a time, each person was called upon to make their own assessment based on their pomegranate tree or based on their fist. And once upon a time, there may have been a degree of variability, but the halachic principle was do your best and follow the measure that you know it to be. Today, meaning the last 300, 500, 1,000 years, a lot of our measurements are much more precise. And that's allowed.
I've heard a story about the Talmudic attitude towards precision of measurements. There is a rule about the dove house and the distance from the dove house where a dove found on the land can be considered belonging to this dove house or being on free realm. Am I describing this problem? Does it ring a bell, Rabbi?
Yes.
So I don't remember the exact measure mentioned in that Gemara, but let's say it was 30 feet. And the student asked, and what if the dove walks along this line with 1 foot closer than 30 feet and another foot further than 30 feet. How do you resolve this sugya? And the answer was, we expel the student.
I don't remember the exact word, but it sounds familiar. But the point,
I don't remember.
I don't want to be giving off the wrong
Masachet,
message.
but I do remember the story that struck me as the attitude towards precision of measurements.
No, so there was a precision to measurements, but there was not a what's the word? There was not necessarily a experiential. There wasn't a consensus that every person would come and have the same measure. And Baruch Hashem, today we have the ability to come up with more precise and synchronized measurements. Now, by that, I want to be careful because there were certain things that did have absolute measures, like weight. Certain things like certain weights were precise. There were certain fluid measurements that were precise. But many of the measurements that we're using are approximate enough.
Rabbi,
give me 1 second. Hang on 1 second.
can't hear you. We can't, I can't hear you. I don't know if anybody else
He's
can.
not saying anything.
Oh, his lips were moving. You
Maybe
know,
he's chewing tobacco.
The other thing going on in the background here is an economic thing. You know, a rich person, big hole, small hole, throw it out. A poor person trying to salvage it.
I'm sorry about that, folks. Pardon me. So, Beryl, I want you to file away this idea because we bring it up, Baruch Hashem, a lot, and it's important to bear in mind that ultimately there is a measurement of a pomegranate, and we have to figure out which pomegranate, but there is such a measure. And to you, every person in their own life, it is precise. It is precisely the measure of a pomegranate, although there may be some variability from town to town or something to that effect.
Rabbi,
Yes,
there's also something going on in the background, and that's an economic question. A gvir has a small hole, throws it out, bang, bang. A poorer person trying to salvage the vessel.
Yeah. But Beryl, even that point we discussed in the Gemara, actually, if you may recall, that we had a question: do we consider different people's socioeconomic conditions in the context of certain measurements? Not these measurements. We're talking about garments. We talked about the size of a material that's susceptible to ritual impurity.
Yeah,
and there was
princes. All Jews are princes.
That's a third Gemara, yes. Beryl, I want to compliment you for your scholarship. To pull three different Gemaras out of a hat, this is real.
If I could only remember where I put my cell phone down, would really be fantastic.
Yes, Beryl. But you're gonna like the story. So let's. So he asked the question. The question is pomegranate. Assuming we know the size of a pomegranate, we don't need to know the size of the pomegranate with precision to appreciate the story. The story is that there was the aggregate of all the holes that had all been repaired collectively equal the size of a pomegranate. This was the question that was asked. Is it tahar? Is it tamei? Amar le Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan, who is here, he's a student. Many times we encounter Rabbi Yochanan as a teacher. And by the way, this is common in the Gemara. We meet certain great sages in different stages in their career. Sometimes they are the junior member of the conversation. They are the student. Sometimes they're the teacher. This is certainly the case of Abaya, who on a number of occasions we met him in the context of his Rebbe, Yosef, and many times we meet him as the authority. Because I think all of us in life experience both parts, hopefully, where we get to be the student and where we get to be the authority. And sometimes we have the privilege of experiencing both simultaneously or concurrently. Amar le Rabbi Yochanan answers his teacher, Rebbe, Shani Salano, you've given us the clue, you've given us the decoder. We can figure out the halach. Because we also discussed sandal, shenifsaka achasmi aznav, v'tikna, a sandal, a shoe, who one of the ears, one of the flaps of the shoe broke, and then it was repaired. Tame midras, it remains susceptible to the ritual impurity of treading on it, which is one of the conventional ways that a shoe or other things might become ritually impure. Nifsika shnia, what happens if now the second flap on the other side breaks? Vitikna, and then he repaired it. Well, guess what? Tahar min hamidras. It is no longer contaminated with ritual impurity. Avotome mage midras, but it is ritually impure for coming in contact with something that had been stepped upon, meaning it loses its initial higher tier impurity. Why? It's ultimately functional. In both scenarios, there was only one missing flap, because by the time the second damage appeared, the first was already repaired. So why is it ritually impure at all? Not Rashi, Arish Steinsaltz. In a sense that it no longer renders the other object ritually impure in the same way a vessel that becomes primary source of ritual impurity. I'm sorry, that's the part we explained already. Basically, it was always the same in the first snapshot, in the second snapshot, after the first flap tore, after the second flap tore. They both were the same, one flap working, one flap not working. So why do we differentiate? Why in the first scenario you said it is still ritually impure, in the second scenario not? But Amris, Lon Ale, you taught us the explanation. Panim chadashos ba'ulakan. The sandal you're holding after having repaired it is a new entity. Rashi. Mishiyardulay tumas midras nischachu panim halalu. The Einzo Harishan Shekfar Niskaklu by Kfedei Bitulay. At the time where you have the second corner torn off, the intact piece is a new piece. And so the keli is no longer the same keli. The vessel you're holding now is a repaired vessel, but it is not the same as the previous vessel. I suppose we might say if you have a car and the car breaks down and you replace the engine, is it the same car? Well, it has the same body. Well, what happens if a few years later the body gets damaged and you replace the body of the car? So now you have a new engine. I know I'm oversimplifying it. I'm not a car guy, but you have a new engine, you have a new body. It's a new car. Even though initially you treated it the same because it had the same frame and the interior and whatever. So I suppose that's what we're saying over here. When you repaired one part, it still had a considerable remnants of the previous keli. But now that both corners have been, well, one is replaced and one is missing, panim chadashos ba'ulakan, this is an entirely new entity. And the same can be said about the vessel with a hole the size of a pomegranate. At the time where there is a collective damage, though it's been repaired, of the size of a pomegranate, the vessel you're holding is a keli. But it cannot be said that it is the original vessel, it is the original keli. It is obviously something very much apart and very, it's original. Just like I maybe there's a more nuanced example than replacing the body and the engine, but I hope you get my point. And that I believe is the point that we're making over here. What was the rabbi's response? Rabbi Yochanan again is engaging with Chizkiah, I think it was. Chizkiah, his teacher. I believe this was in Eretz Yisrael in Israel. He says, young man, not bad. No. Kari alei, he says, you are the kind of person should be described as leis dain bar inish. You are not a human, which then was a compliment. You are not inhumane, but you're not a human being. Rashi says, Ela malach, you're like an angel. You're of a different world. You're of a different dimension. How did you come up with this? Leis dain bar inish. This is not a human. Hikadamri, others say he expressed something slightly different. Kigoin dain bar inish. This is the ideal. This is a man. This is a gever. This is a human being worth celebrating. Rashi, Gavra Bekula. This is the ideal human being. What a mind. That's a nice compliment. And the Gemara continues with briefly referencing some additional compliments. So, it's nice. We're dealing with a very abstract debate about a vessel that's broken, a shoe, a keli, and then we get the privilege of having a little bit of the human side of the experience, the human side of the dialogue injected into our Gemara, it's always a wonderful insight to what the process actually may have looked like. There were humans, there were students that were better, students that were less skilled, teachers that were impressed with their students. And I think also you could read between the lines, Chizkiah probably didn't appreciate Rabbi Yochanan until this point. Rabbi Yochanan ends up being one of the stars of the Talmud, of the oral tradition. But everyone has the moment where they're discovered, which reminds me, I'll bring it up before you do. You saw there was an article going around about a carpet cleaner who speaks 26 languages. Did you see that? I think it was originally in the Washington Post. They has discovered a guy, a simple guy, him and his brother clean carpets. And it turns out that he speaks 26 languages. So, everyone has a moment where they're discovered. It's sad that he was this. Listen, we have people here that are fantastic, special people. And, we always, some people get discovered. And so I think we have some multilingual folks over here, but I don't know if we have anybody that speaks 26 languages. Anyone? I'll call the Washington Post and out you. Professor, I have a feeling you speak more languages than I do. Oh, Russian, English. Okay, that's anything else?
I don't want to go into the area of language in Quebec.
You're right. We have French.
My
speaking
Hebrew is
people.
very rusty, so I wouldn't even count it as a
Sorry?
language I speak. My Hebrew is very rudimentary and very rusty, so I don't think I can say about myself that I do speak Hebrew. But I hope that my English is adequate, although I had serious difficulties describing that story about Dove House. I wasn't sure I was using.
Your problem is that your English is too high a level. So
okay,
that's a compliment. Anyways, okay, so yeah, we have a number of multilingual folks here, if it's Hebrew and English or French and Ivrit or Yiddish or whatever. But I guess 26 languages, that is unique. And so that was his moment. And so here we have Rabbi Yochanan being really given an incredible praise from an incredible sage. Either you are not of this world, you're of a different type, you're a different kind, or you're the ideal human specimen. Halavai, everyone would be like you. Amar Rav Zera, Amar Rabba Bar Zimuna. Along the lines, Rav Zera once said, Im Rishonim b'nei Malachim, Anu b'nei Anashim. Similar to here, he called this guy an angel. If the earlier generations were angelic, we're simple mortals, regular, plain old human beings. Im Rishonim b'nei Anashim. But if you were going to say that the people of times past were human beings, Anu kachamayrim, we don't deserve much more than being akin to donkeys. We're like donkeys. I suppose donkeys were considered unsophisticated relative to humans. Unless you make the mistake and think that we're like one of the special donkeys. No, we mean regular, plain old donkeys. The Gemara tells fantastic stories about the virtue of a Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair's donkey. I think he didn't eat. Maybe he wouldn't do work on Shabbos. Maybe that's Rabbi Chanina ben Doisa's donkey. Here, I'll tell you what it is.
Yeah, Bilam's donkey.
What?
Yeah, Bilam's donkey.
Bilam's donkey, but here we don't say Bilam's donkey, but here we see Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair once was traveling and he came to the inn. The innkeeper wants to feed the animal grain, barley, and the donkey wouldn't eat it. And Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair said, "Did you take tithes?" He says, "Oh, no, I didn't." And so when he took the tithes, the donkey said, "Okay, now I can eat it. Now it's kosher." You ever had your cat or dog look for a kosher sign on the food, on the pet food you feed it? Folks, I'm sorry, I need you to give me one more second. This may be life and death. 1 second. I'm sorry, it was a healthcare proxy for somebody in the ICU. I'm sorry. All right, we'll dedicate the remainder of our study and past for Nachum ben Perla for Peril for Refuah Shlema for complete recovery. So again, the story is a donkey that belonged to Hanina ben Doisa, and he wouldn't eat anything that was unkosher. Again, if your cat or dog will make sure that there's an OU on the dog food, that would be a very impressive event. And then Rabbi Hanina ben Doisa's story was a similar story where he was stolen and he wouldn't eat. I think we had this story in the Gemara. Do you recall it? And they eventually had to bring him back because otherwise he was going to die. We are simply like donkeys relative to generations past. And I think if we'll ask each other, there is a similar notion that we experience where we always, and maybe legitimately, romanticize the people of times past. Our parents, our grandparents were either of a different kind, whether it was their integrity or their devotion to spirituality, perhaps, or whatever it is, or scholarship. And in ways, of course, there are improvements from generations where we have education that's accessible that people didn't once have, and maybe we have career opportunities. But there's certainly many facets of the people that were important to us of times past, and we wonder if we'll ever come close to the caliber of their integrity or whatever it is. And this is not a new phenomenon. We call this Yeridas Hadoros. There is sometimes a gradual descent from generation to generation, and that is being expressed over here in this phrase. And actually, you'll read biographies or you'll hear a eulogy about people. You may hear a reference this Talmud. We are nothing like the generation prior. And of course, this is introduced because of the praise and compliments that are showered upon Rabbi Yochanan. And of course, this is a popular citation because if you look on the side here in Sefaria, it's referenced in Machshava and in Chassidus, and so Musar, etc. And so this is, of course, a central idea in Judaism, but also in society more broadly. You know what? It's just a few minutes, but I think I'm going to pause over here. I want to thank you all for joining us. Pray for good news, for health and well-being for all of the dear members of the Talmud Chabura, those in front and behind of the camera. And again, Nachum ben Peril for a complete and miraculous refuah shlema. And we shall only have good news for all of Klal Yisrael. And again, thank you. Hope to see everyone tomorrow, Thursday, with the Gesundheit and Freilich. Next week, at some point, we may need to either shorten or change the schedule. But for now, certainly this week we'll be on schedule, and next week Monday. At a certain point, we may need to make some revisions to the schedule. So please stay tuned. And then over Pesach as well, we'll be in touch. We'll determine on the Zoom class exactly what that schedule is going to look like. But of course, Pesach may introduce some changes to the schedule. So just a heads up. Have a wonderful day. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Mark, thank you for the picture of the Holy Land, and maybe you can make some order over there.
Yeah, right. Would be nice.
Right. Rabbi, you still recording?
Yeah, right now. I'm going to stop the recording. Go here 1 second.
So